Welcome to Prairie Lakes Church. We are live across Iowa from Decorah to Grinnell to Fort Dodge to Independence. See what I did there, everybody? I think it's hilarious. And everywhere in between, okay? So New Hampton and Osage and Cedar Falls and, of course, all of our friends online. We're really glad that you're joining us, okay? Hey, we're going to get right into some scripture this morning together. So let's just get right into the story, okay? This is from Mark chapter 4, and let's kind of read along together. That day, when the evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, let us go over to the other side. It's the other side of the Sea of Galilee, okay? So it's a pretty big lake, all right? And so they're going to go to the other side. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat, so he just hopped right in. And there were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, in the back, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" And he got up, he rebuked the wind, and he said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. And he said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And they were terrified, and they asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." There is a story. It's a pretty crazy story, and it's one we're going to be diving into a little bit more deeply this weekend and next, because we're starting just a short 2-week series here at Prairie Lakes called The Calm in the Storm, okay? The Calm in the Storm. So here's what we thought might be a good idea, just given where we're at in the calendar. We are post-election, pre-holidays, right? At the time of year where we have every reason to kind of run pretty high on our anxiety level or worry or whatever, right? So we just thought, man, at this time of year, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the very real storms that are kind of raging and swirling both around us and in us. And then let's just talk about the opportunity that we have to lead ourselves well in these storms, and then maybe to lead others as well. Okay. So 2 weeks since the election, almost, and here's what I've noticed in my feed. Okay, my social media feed or news feed or whatever. Maybe you've noticed it in yours as well. But here's what my algorithm is feeding me. I've noticed that there's a lot of folks, a little bit less than half the country, let's say, who are pretty terrified with the results and terrified about the future. And then I've also noticed that there are other folks, a little bit more than half the country, let's say, who are kind of rolling their eyes at those people. Okay, I've noticed that. I've noticed, again, this is like on social media, but I've noticed like Saturday Night Live cast members delivering kind of a heartfelt kind of thing, or late night network TV talk show hosts who just feel very scared about the future. And then I noticed that there are like these top 5 liberal meltdown videos, and I don't know if you've noticed that, but I have. And of course, there also, that's not just the only thing that's in my algorithm, right? There's a lot more kind of serious content in my feed from just all sides. But as I was watching this kind of play out, there was a thread that I stumbled across from a guy named Adam Grant. And Adam he's an organizational psychologist. He's a #1 kind of New York Times bestselling author. If you ever read the book Originals, that was one of his. He's a TED Talk presenter, smart dude. And he had this comment, which I thought was pretty insightful on this dynamic, okay? Here's what he said. I'm just going to throw it up there on the screen so you can kind of see it. He says, "Telling others what to feel is a failure of empathy. People have widely varying reactions to sorrow and heartache. We all process pain in our own ways, in our own timelines. So don't give anyone the power to dictate your emotions or your coping strategies. Telling others what to feel is a failure of empathy. I think it's insightful. I think it's loving. It's a loving idea, even. And I think it's relevant to the moment that we're living in right now, regardless of whether you're really whatever you're feeling about how things went. Because maybe your extended family is like mine, okay? And maybe you're not looking back on what happened, a couple Tuesdays ago. Maybe you're looking ahead to what's going to happen at Thanksgiving or Christmas. Maybe like my wife and I's family, maybe yours is this way as well. Maybe you have moms and dads and aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters and cousins who kind of fall all along the spectrum from terrified to eye-rolling, right? And you feel like you're walking into kind of a tinderbox, right? Because it's just going to take one, oh, that's ridiculous, or oh, you're overreacting, or oh, come on. One of those kind of comments, and then, Now, maybe you're not looking ahead, and maybe that's not the dynamic for you. Maybe it's not about like what's going to be said around those gatherings. Maybe you have 5 Thanksgivings that you have to go to, or 6 Christmases, right? And everybody's got a different set of expectations for your presence, and telling others what to feel about what they're looking back on or looking ahead to really feels like a failure of empathy. It really does. And yet, if we kind of go back to Mark and that story, doesn't it feel, it's kind of like what Jesus did. You just like tell those guys what to feel and what not to feel, isn't it? Isn't it that simple? I mean, just look at the story again, right? Here's what he says after getting this question, don't you care, right? Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Here's what he says. Why are you so afraid? Just have faith. Right? Why are you so afraid? I mean, if only Adam Grant would have been back around in Jesus' day, Back in 1986, okay, archaeologists discovered a remarkably well-preserved first century fishing boat. The kind of boat that Jesus and his followers would have been in. They discovered it in a kibbutz on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. So picture behind me, I'm going to get out of the way of it. You can kind of see the size of this boat that these guys were in. And just you kind of have to imagine that this thing kind of travels up, on both sides, right? So to just give you, but there's a person in front to kind of give you the scale of it. It's about 27, this one would have been about 27 feet long. It would have been about 7.5 feet wide, okay? It could fit maybe like 15 guys or so. Looks a little bit more like a canoe than a yacht, right? So Jesus is laying down in the back of a boat like that, head on a pillow, and just sawing logs probably. I'm imagining Jesus snored. I don't know. I don't think he's less God if he did. But 12 guys are like bailing, trying to, the fact that he's still asleep is incredible, But they wake him up, and the first thing he says isn't sorry, it's not that. The first thing he says is quiet, be still to the storm. And then essentially, the next thing that comes out of his mouth is like, what's the big deal? I mean, isn't this kind of a prime example of a failure of empathy? Is Jesus basically telling his disciples how they should and shouldn't feel around the storm, about the storm that's raging around them? Well, what we know from the story is it's exactly what it felt like to them. Teacher, don't you care? God, don't you care? And this wasn't the kind of storm that, like every Christian worship song it feels like, or album art cover. It's not metaphorical, okay? The storm wasn't just in their heads. It wasn't just their opinion. It wasn't just something that was up for debate, or depending on your perspective, or all of those things that when we hear them, we get a little frustrated. These were real waves, really cold water, really filling up a literal boat out in the middle of a really big lake, which was notorious, by the way, for kind of swallowing up ferry passengers and fishermen alike. And I'm not trying to be morbid here, right? Because we read stories like that. I mean, if you were in it, you probably knew a mom or a dad or a kid who got caught in a storm like that and didn't make it. Why am I afraid? Why do you have to ask? Their anxiety was real because the storm was real. It wasn't imagined. And it's kind of an arresting, stark, confusing contrast in the story if you think about it, because 12 guys are scared for their lives because the water's filling up the boat faster than they can bail it out. And this other guy's completely oblivious to the storm, and also everybody else experiences of the storm, just zonked out on his pillow. And this story in Mark reminds me of the story of our very first camping trip as a Tink family, okay? So my wife and I, our very first camping trip after we had our first kid, Jude. And Jude was all of 3 months old, okay? But we weren't going to be one of those families that gets all cooped up in their house. You know, we were going to get on with our lives, right? And we had this 12-person Browning tent, and we took some friends, and we set this tent up down. We were at Wapsipinicon State Park, okay, which is just kind of northeast of Cedar Rapids, Anamosa area, and it was going great, okay? Jude was a pretty easy baby. Our friends were super helpful, right? But we were also, besides just having a good time, we were also kind of watching the radar. Because there was a storm coming, okay? And it was either going to like skate right by us or not skate right by us, okay? So got to be lights out time. We put Jude down, no problem. He goes to sleep. You know, he's in one side of this big tent in his pack and play. We set up a big air mattress on the other side. And about 2 a.m., I was woken up by just the sound of rain on the tent, you know, which wasn't a surprise. And you could kind of hear the thunder in the distance and kind of see the lightning kind of brighten up the tent just for a little bit. But in the span of about 10 minutes, okay, it was not long, that thunderstorm was on top of us, okay? And you look at the radar and it's like, oh, that's a purple cell that's right on top of us. And then the rain stopped being rain and it started to hail in this tent. And the thunder was so loud that it kind of like shook your chest and your stomach, you know? And I remember having this thought, well, you know, it's confirmed I am the worst dad in the world. Got my brand new baby, my wife, out in the middle of the storm in a tent, you know? Now, here's the craziest part of the story, okay? That 3-month-old baby of ours did not stir. I'm not kidding you. Didn't even grunt. Like, he was so quiet, it made me think, like, is there something wrong with him, you know? I remember going back to our side of the tent and telling Aaron, you're just not gonna believe it. Look at this kid, you know? And I think when you hear a story like that, or even when you read a story like the one we read in Mark, I think it's probably the easiest for us to put ourselves in the shoes of the people who are anxious about the storm, because that's our experience. It's the easiest to put ourselves in the shoes of the disciples, you know, or of these two brand new parents who feel, at least one of them felt like, we're in trouble. That's our experience. That's our experience. But what I think might be a better starting point for us this weekend is to put ourselves in the pack and play. Or to put ourselves in the position of the guy who's got his head on a pillow. In other words, I want to just ask the question, you know, and maybe if we can't just discover something about how can someone remain so uncommonly, almost irrationally at peace when there's a very real storm swirling around them. And I want to start just by looking at the person of Jesus, okay? You read the story along with me. I don't know if you believe the story or not. But you've read it at the very least. And, apparently Jesus can just control the weather. He's got a magic God switch, right? That's Jesus' story, the magic God switch. Just to control all of the things that control us. I mean, it's no wonder that he's not scared, Must be nice to be the Son of God. If only he could be a bit more understanding of the rest of us who don't have that switch, right? Well, that's actually not true, and it's not true about Jesus either. Jesus didn't have a magic God switch. Okay? His calm demeanor didn't come because he had control over everything because he was the Son of God. That's actually not good Christology. Now, I don't want to get too nerdy on you, too seminary on you, but good Christology, a faithfully biblical view on the person of Jesus requires you to remember that Jesus didn't have any power of his own. Jesus was human, exactly like us. Now, theologians, here's what they call this. I've talked about this just a little bit before. They call it the kenosis, which is a Greek word that Paul uses in his letter to the church in Philippi to describe Jesus. This word kenosis is translated as Jesus made himself nothing, or emptied himself, or gave up his divine privileges, like it's going to say in the New Living Translation. Just look at this with me. This is from Philippians 2. Talking about Jesus. Though Jesus was God, he didn't think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave. He was born as a human being, fully human. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God, and he died a criminal's death on the cross, okay? Think of it this way. The disciples had Thor in the boat with them, but Thor didn't have his hammer. It's not, the metaphor does break down, okay? Jesus was always, by nature, God. His nature doesn't change. He's always the person of God. But in a very real sense, in this moment in the boat, in terms of his natural abilities, he is just as powerless and out of control as everybody else. And yet, he doesn't wake up in a panic. And when he spoke, the storm listened. So the question that we need to ask is, how? How does Jesus do that if he doesn't have a magic God switch? If he willingly gave up his divine privileges? If he's human like the rest of us in these moments in terms of his power, how did he do it? Well, it's because this is true of him and it's true of us too. Before, it's about how you react to life's storms. It's about who is in the boat with you. I want to just, if you could, just allow me to continue to shift your perspective a little bit on this story. Just continuing on who Jesus is first, and then maybe shift it to who we are or might be in Christ. But let's talk about Jesus first, okay? Because you and I, we read these crazy stories, calming the storm, healing the blind, feeding thousands of people. And when we do, I think we have a tendency to think like this is just something that just was reserved for the Son of God because of his God switch. When in reality, these stories are actually a lot more human than you might think. So just what I mean by this is Jesus was and is and always will be God in his nature, okay? But when Jesus was walking the earth, the reason that he had the ability to perform miracles wasn't because he was God. It was because he remained connected to God. That's how he did all of these things. Not in his own godlike power, but because he was connected as a human being to God's power. Everything he ever did. He had this perfect, unbroken spiritual connection with his heavenly Father. Jesus is a picture of what it's like to be human when you're perfectly connected to God. Just consider that, okay? Jesus is a picture in these moments of what it's like to be human when you're connected to God. It's why he always went up these lonely places to pray, because he was always listening, always obedient, always trusting, always submitted, this perfect, unbroken connection to his Father in heaven. He goes from being the eternal source of power to being a conduit of God's power. Doesn't change his nature, changed his position. Which means, okay, when Jesus was performing all these miracles, he wasn't simply proving that he was God by nature, although that he did. But when Jesus is doing all these miracles, he's also showing us what it means to be truly human. He's showing us what God can do in us and even through us, through real people like you and me, when we are connected to God. I mean, I know this is hard to believe, but this is what Jesus says in John 14, okay? He says the same thing. Very truly, I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing. And they'll do even greater things than these, because I'm going to the Father. So what are you saying? You're saying we can control the weather? That's worth a try, I think, right? Obviously, God had things that he needed Jesus to uniquely do, because Jesus' mission was a little unique, right? There's some obvious uniqueness to that. But what I am saying is this: you and I, we can be just as calm as Jesus was in these storms. We can be just as calm. Jesus was able to be the calm in the storm, okay? Not because the storm wasn't real, okay? He was able to be the calm in the storm, not because the storm wasn't real, not because it wasn't big, but because there wasn't a storm raging inside of him. The storm was real, and it was really big. But in the middle of this really big and really real storm, Jesus was calm because inside of him there wasn't a storm raging. He just listened to God before he listened to the storm, so he could speak to the storm instead of the storm speaking to him. Like, I genuinely believe this in the story. He has this perfect, unbroken connection with God. And so when he woke up, the first thing he heard wasn't the wind and the waves. The first thing he heard was God's voice, telling him what to say and telling him what to do. And he did it. He listened to God before he listened to the storm. I don't know what storms are raging inside of you right now, okay? I don't know what storms are raging around you right now. And in no way do I want to come off as unempathetic, as diminishing some of those storms. But what I do want you to do is maybe consider listening to God first before you listen to that storm. Because God might have something to say to you that will calm the storm in you, so that you might be able to speak to that storm or speak to that storm in others. I want to invite you to listen to God first, okay? I want to close with a story here. Uh, I don't know if you guys have, so I'm a dude, shocker, and part of just being a guy in the family that I grew up in, on my dad's side, we had a little bit of a rite of passage kind of thing. For a few generations, the Tink men would go up almost annually, really, to a fishing trip in Canada. Now, when I say a fishing trip in Canada, I don't mean just across the border in Minnesota. I mean, we went 12 hours into Saskatchewan, north of the border, okay? It's like a 24-hour trip from Waterloo, Cedar Falls. And, a few generations ago, they literally cut their way in and got on these lakes and fished. And just great, it's great fishing. But, this is pre-cell phone days and stuff like that. I mean, it's not a 100% safe thing to do, but, you grew up kind of listening to the stories as a kid and seeing the pictures as a kid and seeing these massive northern, these massive walleye. And, so I was 16, and at 16, I was old enough to where I went up with my dad and his brother, and then my cousin, his brother's son. The four of us went up there, had a great time. Portaged in, did the whole thing, caught fish that were bigger than I've ever seen in my life. And now we're going to make our way out, okay? So from when we got out of the car to when we finally got to our campsite, it was a full day, all right? You get up really early, and you kind of get to camp and get it kind of set up by the time it was dark. So, I mean, it's a full day. But on the way out, it was raining. And we were in canoes, okay? So these canoes have a little kind of yoke on the back, and we'll put a little outboard motor on the back of these canoes to get us across some huge lakes. It's raining on the way out. It's June, and up there, June, the temperatures have started to rise, but it still gets pretty cold. In fact, there's parts where ice is still on some of those lakes. So water's pretty cold. And still to this day, my dad and I disagree on whose fault it was. I'll tell you whose fault it was not. And I have a microphone and he doesn't. But we're on the way out, and we dump into the lake. Okay. And I was 16, I remember just shocked, right, at how cold that water was, and getting up and I was screaming. I wasn't crying. I was just screaming, And then some part of my consciousness, I could hear my name, first time, second time, third time, and then finally I heard it like very loudly, like someone was yelling my name. Of course it was my dad. It snapped me out of my panic. I stopped screaming for a half second, and he goes, "Are you all right?" Yes. I'm very cold, but I'm all right. He's like, all right, swim over. The canoe had kind of righted itself. It was so packed full, right, that we hardly lost any gear, okay? Grabbed onto the canoe. My uncle swung around, got us to shore. We built a fire, got warmed up. It was very cold, but we got warmed up, got to the car. It was a great story. But I remember stories like that because when I finally listened to my dad, okay, it didn't change my circumstances. I was still in the middle of this flipping cold lake, but it did change my perspective. I went from being a victim of this storm, so to speak, to being okay in the middle of it. Just because I listened to my dad. We have to be a church that listens to God first. Because if the storms that are raging in the world around us are raging inside of us as well, people are not going to see that there is a God in charge of it all. And there is. We don't have to diminish other people's storms. We don't have to tell them it's not a big deal. We just have to listen to God first so that we can be the calm in the storm. And next week, we'll talk a little bit more practically about how we can be that for others. But let me pray us out, okay? Father in heaven, thank you for these challenging and encouraging stories. God, we want to be just a group of people who love and follow you, who listen to you first. God, who don't check out of just the very real responsibility and capacity we have to, just like your son Jesus, be at peace and to watch the storm swirl around us, but be the calm in the storm for others. Help us to do that. Jesus, in your name we pray. Amen.